We're starting in this section of this course on ecology, and it makes sense to start this new section of the course with a discussion of what ecology is and what it isn't. Ecology can be thought of as the science that deals with the interactions that living organisms participate in. And these interactions can fall into a few different categories. So for example, you can have interactions among individuals that are all of the same species. You can also have interactions between individuals that are in different species. So for example, here is an insect that's being eaten by a carnivorous plant. That is an interspecific interaction, and it falls under the heading of ecology. You can also have interactions between living organisms and the non-living environment that they inhabit. Things like the abiotic, the non-living conditions like temperature or weather or other conditions that they find themselves in. So all of these fall under the heading of ecology. It's important for me to note also what ecology isn't. It's not the same as environmental science. Environmental science is a science that deals with the interaction between people and their living and non-living environment. Ecology deals with interactions of organisms of any kind. Ecology is also not the same as environmentalism. Environmentalism is an ideology or a political position devoted to the conservation of the natural world. And it's not to say that you can't find ecologists who are also environmental scientists or ecologists who are also environmentalists. In fact, a lot of environmentalism relies on ecology in one way or another, but they aren't the same thing. We're going to be looking at ecology at a few different levels during this part of the course. And so I might as well walk up through all the levels that are involved in biology, just so you get a sense of the context where we're starting out. Obviously, if you go down to a very, very small level, there are atoms, and the atoms make up molecules. So those are some of the most basic, smallest levels that are relevant in biology. When you build together enough molecules in the appropriate way, you get cells. And the cell is the basic unit of any living organism, at least the living organisms that we're going to be considering in this course. When you put together a lot of cells of the same types, you end up with a tissue. And a tissue is a group of cells that have similar functions that are coordinated in some way. If you put together several tissues, you can get an organ. So that's when tissues are working together towards a similar function. Most of the organisms that we're going to be working with in this course, or thinking about in this course, are self-contained individuals, and they're recognizable as being individuals separate from other individuals. There are going to be some interesting exceptions to that. There are colonial organisms where it's very hard to tell where one individual starts and the next ends. Organisms can have one cell each, or they can have multicellular. Can be multicellular, in which case some of these levels kind of collapse into one. Ecology really starts when you're looking at the next level up. If you have a number of individuals of the same population, or the same, if you have another number of individuals of the same species, they're called a population. So when you have individuals that are interbreeding, that's what we're considering a population in the evolutionary sense. When it comes to ecology, the boundaries are a little mushy here. It can be individuals that are interbreeding, it can be individuals that are interacting in some way, but generally all the individuals of the same species in a particular reasonably discrete place can be considered to be a population. When you put together multiple populations of different species that are found together at a particular place in time, those are called a community. And the definition of a community, the edges of a community, can be even more blurry than the edges of a population. Because usually when you talk about community dynamics or community ecology, you're not talking about all the populations, all the species that are present in a particular place. there will be some group of species that is relevant to what you're studying, and so you're only going to be considering those. So for example, when biologists look at a community out in a forest, they might be interested in the tree community, which is actually a very restricted set of the organisms that are present in a forest. But if you're focusing in on just the trees, it's sensible to include just some of those species. If you're looking at a coral reef community, you might be interested in all the organisms, but probably you're going to be focusing in mostly on the macroorganisms. You're not really going to be thinking about the microorganisms so much. So remember that these terms do have fairly flexible definitions, and keep in mind what the definitions is that you're working with as you run across examples in this course. There's another level up from the community that is called the ecosystem. An ecosystem is the community, all the living organisms in a particular place at a particular time. But then you add in the non-living elements. So the light, the heat, the water, the air that's available, the minerals that are in the ground, that plus all the living things makes up an ecosystem. If you add together all the ecosystems in the world, what you have is what's called the biosphere. And that's the largest level of biological organization that there is, at least until we discover life on other planets. So we're going to start today at the level of the population. Again, you've got a group of individuals of the same species. They live close to one another to interact. And the question then becomes, what are their interactions like? This is the sort of thing that ecologists study at the population level. The most basic description of a population is how many individuals are there in it. So demographics is the study of who is in a population. So this is the most basic fact about a population's demographics. How many individuals are there? Why should you care about this? Well, actually, there are a lot of reasons. Some organisms are very beneficial to us, and so we really care about how many there are. These can be domesticated animals, or they can be wild animals that we depend on for food or economic reasons. They can also be organisms that we care about in terms just of their conservation, organisms that we want to keep their numbers up, or we want to save them from extinction. There are also organisms that are very harmful to us. So there are invasive species that come in and damage native ecosystems. They somehow compromise them, or they threaten native species. There are also a very large number of organisms that are pathogens or parasites, either of us or of organisms, like you just saw the beneficial organisms, that we care about. So we're going to care very much about how many individuals there are in populations when we're talking about all these different kinds of species, the beneficial and the deleterious, the harmful ones. So what I'm going to be doing today is mostly dealing with a couple of mathematical models. And mathematical models are incredibly useful in ecology. They're also something that a lot of students are very turned off by, because a lot of students are frankly very turned off by math as a whole. What I'm hopefully going to be able to convince you of during this part of the course is that the math that you'll encounter in this course is not particularly to be feared, and that it can be a very useful tool. Really, a mathematical model is just a statement about the real world. It's a statement, in our case, it's going to be a statement about ecology, but it's couched in the language of mathematics rather than in, say, English. So let's take a look at how you can translate a sentence in English about the number of individuals in a population into a sentence in math. Let's suppose that you have a fox population. You've got a certain number of foxes in a population, and you're wondering, how many are there going to be in this population next year? Well, okay, you're going to start out with the number of foxes this year. So if n sub 1 is the number of foxes next year, Okay, well, you know that there are a certain number of foxes this year. That's n sub 0. You know, a certain number of foxes are going to be born between this year and next. I'll call that capital B. There are going to be a certain number of deaths. So you subtract the number of deaths from this number here. And that's what you've got. That's the number of foxes you're going to have next year. The number you've got now, plus the number of births, minus the number of deaths. Okay? Why would we bother making mathematical models? Well, it's true that almost any mathematical model is going to be more complicated than what we've got here, and you can do more complicated things with that kind of a model. But there are a number of ways in which even a model that's this simple can yield some useful properties. One of the things that you can do with a mathematical model is that you can manipulate it to get insights into what's going on out in the real world. If you have a confidence that you have captured in your mathematical model all of the facts and processes that are most important for determining what happens at the size of a population over time, then you can ask yourself, you know, I wonder if the birth rate were to double, how rapidly would this population grow? Or if the death rate were to go up by 10%, you know, what would happen to this population? Would it begin shrinking? These are the sort of questions that allow you to make predictions. Okay, and this is one of the most powerful things about mathematical models, is instead of waiting around to see what happens, you can plug the right numbers into your model, and you can predict what's going to happen before it actually happens. This is extremely useful when the phenomenon that you're dealing with is something that is irrevocable. It's something that can't be changed once it happens. So, for example, one of the things that ecologists often do is they often make mathematical models about population growth or shrinkage, and they ask, is this species likely to go extinct in the next 50 years? And that's the sort of thing that you really like to be able to predict ahead of time, because once you actually see it happen, there's nothing you can do. The most important realm in which mathematical models are probably applied these days is with respect to climate change. And obviously that's a case where we really want to know what is going to happen in the next 10, 20, 50 years, because we've got to be acting now if we're going to be able to change that outcome. So if a model is made so that it really closely matches reality, you can use it to make predictions. But one thing that's really interesting about mathematical models, and sometimes much more useful than using them to make predictions, is what happens when you make predictions and the predictions are wrong. That's actually, in many cases, a very, very useful thing. Because when you compare your model to reality and you find that they don't agree, that tells you there's something that's missing in the model, something you haven't realized that you need to take into account. And what that can do is then lead you to go out and start asking questions about, okay, it looks like we're missing this sort of aspect from this model. Let's go out into the real world and figure out what it is that we need to take into account. In other words, a model can lead you to look for things that you didn't already know. And it can actually guide you to look for, you know, this is where you need to be looking for this thing that you don't know about. So what do I want you to be able to do with one of these models? Well, for one thing, I want you to know basically what the different variables mean biologically. Okay, I want you to be able to tell me what this quantity is, but I also want you to be able to tell me, you know, why is that biologically important? What's the implication of that? I also want you to know how these equations behave. And by that I mean things like you should be able to look at this equation and say, you know, if big B here, the number of births in the population each year, goes up, what is that going to do to n sub 1? If you hold everything else constant, you increase big B, what's that going to do to n sub 1, the size of the population next year? Okay, things like that are what are called the behavior of equations. Right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange this equation a little bit, put it in a different form. It's still going to say the same thing, but it's going to say it slightly differently in a way that maybe will be more useful as we go on and use it as a model. And the first thing I'm going to do, so we've got a certain number of individuals in the population right now. Here's the total number of births, the total number of deaths, and I'm going to divide both of these by this. Okay, so that we've got, we just multiplied each one of these. We multiplied big B times n sub 0 over n sub 0, so that's fair mathematically. And we multiplied big D by n sub 0 over n sub 0. Okay, we're going to rename these. We're going to call this little b, and this one we're going to call little d. So that our equation is now looks like this. Number of individuals next year are the number of individuals this year times the number of individuals this year, plus the number of individuals this year times little b minus little d. What do these new variables, these little b and little d, mean? Well, you can look at it as instead we're talking about big D and big B. We're talking about the total number of births and deaths in the population. When we get to the small letters, little b and little d, we're looking at the births and deaths from the perspective of an individual fox in this population. So little b is the total number of births in the population divided by the number of individuals in the population. Or to put it another way, it's the number of births per individual in a year on average. So you could look in the head of this fox and it's thinking, how many offspring am I likely to have this year? Well, on average, each individual fox in the population has little b offspring. Okay, little d is the total number of deaths in the population divided by the number of individuals. In other words, it's the number of deaths per individual in the population, which is similar, it's not quite the same, but it's similar to the answer to the question, how likely is it that I will die this year? Okay. The technical names for these two variables are the per capita birth rate and the per capita death rate. Per capita rates refer to the rate per individual in a population. And usually, this is what you're referring to when you see a variable that has a lowercase letter. It's also what you're referring to anytime you see something like 1 over n. N is the notation that's usually used in ecology to refer to the size of a population. So capital N is the variable that tells you this is the population size. When you see 1 over n, that means that you're thinking about something on a per capita basis, per individual basis. Generally, when you see uppercase letters, like the big B and the big D, then that equation is talking about what's happening in the population as a whole. So this is something that it would be good if you got comfortable with it so that you don't mix up big B and little b, big D and little d. It's going to be very important in some cases to be able to shift back and forth between this per capita point of view, you know, what's happening from the perspective of an individual in this population, and what's happening at the whole population view. You know, when you step back, how many births are there in the whole population? One way of writing b minus d is this single variable, R max. Now, so far, there's an assumption I haven't told you about, but right now what we're thinking about a population that is the simplest possible population, simplest possible circumstance. And that means that there aren't any limitations on population growth. Every fox in the population is growing and reproducing. It has all the food it needs, it has all the water it needs, the space it needs, all of its needs are completely and overabundantly met. Okay, so that basically it is cranking out little fox kids at the maximum possible rate. Okay, if that's the case, then the growth rate of the population is R max. R is the per capita population growth rate. And in the equations that we're going to be dealing with, the exponential equation, the logistic growth equation, we're only going to be dealing with R max. The rate at the per capita population growth rate, if everything is perfect in terms of resources, is the per capita population growth rate if organisms have everything they need to survive and reproduce. Okay, let's rearrange our equation just a little bit more. This term is kind of in our way, so we're going to subtract it from both sides. There we go. And now n sub 1 minus n sub 0, there's a different way of writing that that's a little bit easier. You'll often see it written as delta n over delta t. So what it means is it's the change in n, it's change in population size, over, in this case, 1 year. Because n sub 1 and n sub 0 are observations made 1 year apart. Okay, so here's our equation that we've ended up with. Delta n over delta t equals n sub 0 times R max. Usually you'll see it written like this, R max times n. So we've got the population growth rate, the rate at which the entire population is adding individuals. Another version of this equation that you often see, and notice that this is mathematically the same, is to divide both sides by n. And then you get this. Delta n over n delta t is equal to R max. And this is the per capita population growth rate because you're dividing by n. So here you've got the population growth rate. Here you've got the per capita population growth rate. The only difference is whether or not you've divided by n. This equation is the most basic population growth equation that there can be. It's called the exponential growth equation. And exponential growth is essentially what any population has the potential to go through if there are enough resources that every individual in the population is reproducing as fast as it can and living as long as it can.